Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It is January 25th, 2019, and I, as always, could not be more excited to have with us back on Mormon Stories podcast, historian, friend, scholar, priest, I don't know what to call you, pastor.
70.
John Hamer. You would have to be dead or something to not know who John Hamer is if you're a regular Mormon Stories listener. We've had John Hamer on numerous times to talk about a number of issues because he's so knowledgeable about Mormon history, Mormon scholarship, Mormon studies, etc. John Hamer is currently a 70 for Community of Christ, which, for those of you who don't know, is once was the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But John Hamer was raised devout Mormon, attended BYU, and within the past several years, reaffiliated with Community of Christ, became one of the leaders of the Toronto congregation, where he and his family sort of helped lead that church, and recently was called as a 70 for Community of Christ. And we are bringing him on today because we are in the middle of a new initiative on Mormon Stories podcast. For those of you who don't know, we've started an initiative that we're calling the Truth Claims Initiative. We're introducing some new web content to mormonstories.org. If you go to mormonstories.org/truth-claims, you will see a series of web pages that we are currently editing and massaging. And we just want Mormon Stories to have some online web content that help address or explain the story behind many of the church's truth claims. So if you think about it, for many years, the LDS Church didn't necessarily teach openly its history. And there's been a reckoning over the past 10 years where the church has come more clean about its history, and even has published several gospel topics essays trying to address some of the more problematic historical notions and issues and problems and conflicts with the church. However, grateful we are for that progress, for those steps towards transparency. I think many, if not most, fair-minded people would agree that the church still has a long way to go to be fully transparent and open about its history. So what we're doing on Mormon Stories is we're writing the essays that the church should have written, and we're publishing them so that people can get a sense for the story of the church's truth claims. And we have an accompanying billboard campaign to help promote this initiative. So right now, if you go to mormonstories.org/treasure, you're going to see our first episode, our first initiative, which is a big long essay on Joseph Smith's treasure digging and folk magic. And in conjunction with that, we've interviewed several scholars and historians to discuss Joseph Smith's use of folk magic and treasure digging, which includes Kathleen Melanakis, Dan Vogel, John Hamer. We've interviewed Richard Bushman and others in the past. And so all of that you can find on one page. And right now we have a billboard on I-15 that says, was Joseph Smith the treasure digger? ? Go to mormonstories.org/treasure. And it's got the Mormon Stories logo. So that's the campaign that's going on right now. Right now, we're also furiously completing 3 essays on the Book of Mormon that talk about the cultural context that informed the Book of Mormon. It talks about, the process for the Book of Mormon, many of the sources of inspiration that we think inform the Book of Mormon text. And we hope within a few weeks to be releasing that essay, both for revision and review, but also for final publication. And we'll be switching the billboard to say something to the effect of, who wrote the Book of Mormon, or how was the Book of Mormon created, with the question mark. And that'll be the second billboard, and hopefully is at least a 12-month billboard campaign. And that's kind of what we're doing. And we're going to be interviewing several people for the Book of Mormon episode. We've already interviewed Dan Vogel about the Book of Mormon's creation. So you can go to mormonstories.org right now and get Dan Vogel's view, a good 3 hours of Dan Vogel on how the Book of Mormon was created. But now we also have, we can't do this topic without John Hamer. And so today we're going to be doing part 2 of our in-depth interview with John Hamer. Part 1 was around treasure digging and folk magic. Today we're going to be covering the Book of Mormon's 19th century context. A lot of important information to help us understand the background behind the Book of Mormon that informed its composition, a bunch of information that's largely forgotten today. And then we're going to bring John Hamer back for a final episode in this series on his actual theory on how the Book of Mormon itself was composed, with the timeline and with, you know, his sense for how it was created. So that's what we're in store for today. We're really grateful for everyone who has joined us on Facebook Live. John, one of John's many, many talents is he's a graphic designer. He's a cartographer. He's a map maker. He actually helped create maps, as I understand it, for the Joseph Smith Papers Project, which is amazing. But he's also designed more book covers for Mormon books than probably anyone alive. So he's a gifted graphic designer, and he's put together 99 slides for this presentation that we're going to use to inform it. So if you can check out either the Facebook video of this or the YouTube video once it's released, you'll get an even more robust and aesthetically pleasing set of data or information that always lovingly and beautifully complements John's verbal audio eloquence. So check out the video version of this episode if you can. And of course, if you want to support the billboard campaign, we have enough money to fund 3 months. It costs $5,800 a month to put a billboard up on I-15 in Salt Lake City. This billboard right now is on the right side, south facing, around 3200 south as you're driving north. You can see it up on the right-hand side. If you want to see this billboard continue, we're going to need your support. So you can go to mormonstories.org/billboard. If you believe in this campaign, if you want to support the awareness of truth claims, and if you want to help other people understand Mormon history better, support this campaign. 100% of your donations to the billboard go to the billboard. We'll take no overhead out of that. It's all to fund the billboard. And just one final thing. Some people felt like our current billboard campaign is a little bit sharp-elbowed. They think it feels a little bit more anti-Mormon. Our first billboard just simply said, "Know your religion." Everyone agrees. I think that was a really brilliant first billboard. But some people feel like the question, was Joseph Smith a treasure digger with the question mark, was a little bit aggressive, maybe even smelt of anti-Mormonism. Whether or not you believe that, I just want to say one thing. Our goal is not to take people out of Mormonism. It's not to create disbelief within Mormonism. If somebody's happy with Mormonism and happy with their understanding of Mormon history, we are thrilled for them. And we want them to stay exactly where they are, as happy as they want to be. There are a lot of people who either want to know the true Mormon history because for them truth or history or evidence matters, or they're just interested in this stuff, or their engagement with the church, their tithing, their time, their commitment, their devotion, their reputation, all the stuff that they give to the church is based on a certain understanding of the church's history and of its truth claims. But if they had different information, they might make different choices with their time, with their money, with their reputation, with their devotion, etc. We just feel like everybody deserves to be fully informed about the church's history so that they can make informed decisions about their lives. And those are the people we're targeting with this campaign. People who are questioning or wanting to learn more. We're going to provide them with a more honest and open and accurate version of Mormon history than the Mormon Church itself is providing. And we're going to work to be unbiased and fair with all this information, both in terms of the podcasts and with the written word. So those are our motives. It's not to tear people away from the church. It's not to destroy belief. It's just to help those who are interested find a more accurate understanding of the world and of the church and of reality. For whatever reasons, people might want an accurate, healthy, fair view of the church. So that's our motives. Please understand that, and we'll talk about that more. If you want to do a favor for your friends and family right now, share this live stream on your Facebook page. Just say, hey, an amazing scholar, John Hamer, is about to share some really important information about the Book of Mormon. If we can get 30 or 40 people to share this right now, it's going to help a lot of people come to understand the Book of Mormon and the church better. So I'm going to be refreshing this event, and I hope to see at least 30 shares, within 15 to 20 minutes of this launching, because that's how we get the word out, is through people sharing. Just like the church sends out missionaries, we should all be missionaries for truth. And what you're going to get today is more truth about the Book of Mormon than you've probably ever gotten before. So I don't know if that's too much of a build-up.
That's a lot of an expectation.
Without any further ado, John Hamer, welcome to Mormon Stories podcast.
Thank you. So excited to be here always. I always enjoy these conversations. I love all the work you're doing. And I feel like this new initiative, it's a great way to take this amazing wealth of content that now over all these years that you've kind of compiled, bringing it together, like you say, into a particular page, have some summaries, also a great essay to tie it together, but then also the links to, let's say, past podcasts that you've done on that purpose. It helps people organize their thoughts on all these things and find all of this. And I think the idea of the billboard is just bringing that to a bunch of eyes that maybe aren't otherwise seeing it, because people aren't already in the podcasting as a community, or listening to podcasts, and so then this is a new way to get eyeballs on it. I mean, to the charge that the current billboard that you have is sharp elbowed. I mean, I kind of feel like that for people for whom they're not really aware of Joseph Smith's history at all, that may seem like a very I don't know, a sharp term to say treasure digger, but I mean, the answer is he is a treasure digger, and it's very, we know that from the sources. The church history department is quite aware of that, and I don't know. So I should think that isn't. I mean, it isn't actually historically partisan to be saying that, is what I'm suggesting. So,
yeah, and that's one of the weird things about the church's Gospel Topics Essays program. The church is acknowledging all this stuff, and they're taking the time and money to publish these essays, but they're also really hesitant to want to share it broadly because they don't want to infect people with disbelief. Yeah. And so the church is in this conundrum of wanting to be open and honest, but wanting to be very judicious about who actually knows about the essays. So I meet all these progressive and post-Mormons who are in trouble with their bishops and stake presidents because they have lost belief or have spoken openly about a lot of these issues: Book of Abraham, polygamy, Book of Mormon, etc. They're in trouble with their bishop or stake president because the bishop or stake president not only hasn't read or absorbed this information, they don't even know that the essays exist. And that's still a reality in 2019, is that most bishops and stake presidents not only have not read these essays, but don't know that they exist. And that's unacceptable, because we need broad awareness. And I think even Russell Ballard said every Mormon needs to come to understand and reconcile with its true history. And so we're doing our part to help Elder Ballard and others spread the good word and spread the good information that the church itself has acknowledged. And you're right, the church has acknowledged that Joseph Smith was a treasure digger, that he did get busted for it, and they've got their own essay about that. So, right. So yeah, so that's so thank you, John, for that endorsement. Anything else you want to say or to correct, kind of before we jump in?
No, I think that sounds great. Yeah, we can go ahead. I mean, there's so much material, like you say, 99 slides, and I even at that point couldn't even get to the composition process, and so therefore that's why we have a part 3. So we'll see how long it takes to go through all of this. It's exciting.
All right. So why don't you tell us just in a few words what we're about to see, just so people get a sense for what set it up with a little bit of context.
Yeah. So the idea here is that I think that when people now in the 21st century get a hold of the Book of Mormon, it is such a alien, strange thing that it's in a way it's the idea of it, even the idea that ancient Israelites got in boats and went to the Americas and became the Native Americans, or the primary ancestors of the Native Americans, or however you want to say it. This is like it seems like a completely, I don't know, out like Atlantis style, some kind of crazy thing that you some kind of very kooky very strange and unique idea thing at the minimum unique, and of course it's the object of ridicule in the Book of Mormon musical and things like that, where the I Believe song has that as a real laugh line. I believe that ancient Jews and boats came to America, all of these kind of things. But the reality of it is, what I'm going to show you is that, in fact, in its context, in its time period, in 1830, when the Book of Mormon is published, that this idea is actually totally commonplace. This is the accepted understanding, the accepted worldview of how the Americas fits into what was then primarily a biblical worldview otherwise that people had, and how we could explain based on people's understanding or literal reading of the Bible and its history, everything from Noah and the flood, and how you could then explain why there would be people in the Western Hemisphere, why they aren't mentioned in the Bible, all this kind of thing. The basic ideas, and we'll get to it anyway, that the Book of Mormon talks about a lost, highly civilized race who has been exterminated, presumably in the antiquity, by the Native Americans, the Nephites, and the Lamanites. That story is entirely well known to everybody at the time period prior to the publication. Everybody, European Americans. And so anyway, we'll talk about that. And I also want to give a little bit of context, also, or a little bit of a description of the academic discipline of literary criticism, or the study of text itself, which is one of the academic disciplines, like the discipline of history or archaeology, that we use to look back at the past. And it's one that's absolutely essential because history, when you're a historian, you have to work from text. The idea of history, is how you read the text, how you understand the primary sources from the past in order to reconstruct what you believe is the most likely scenario given all of the other source material, and we have to read into them. Well, part of the idea then is we have to understand when was any given text written, and so this is going to give us a little background of how that discipline has emerged, how we understand those kind of things, and how scholars have from the beginning applied that to Scripture, specifically the Bible. And so with those kind of things, we can see, again, the Book of Mormon, how we understand to date it as a composition, and then also how the context around it, how the story that it tells is actually completely within that early 19th century context.
I love it. Really quickly, one of the things I love about you is that you are an active member of a restoration. You're a leader in a restoration branch.
Yes.
So somebody might say, well, you must hate Mormonism. You must hate the Book of Mormon. You must hate Joseph Smith.
Right.
You must hate religion. Let's talk very briefly about your love for Mormonism and the restoration, because you're a 70 in a sister church.
Right. So yeah. So obviously we're in the same way that people in the LDS Church, or rather, you're not even allowed to say that anymore. People in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, headquarters in Salt Lake City, Utah, are no longer able to say that we're no longer supposed to say the word Mormon, to describe themselves, right? And so in that same kind of way, the people in Community of Christ haven't ever really adopted the term Mormon to describe themselves, but essentially, like you said, Community of Christ is name from the 1870s on was the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and so the tradition goes all the way back to 1830, just like the LDS Church, I'm going to say, because I can't keep saying the whole thing. So just like the LDS Church goes all the way back, since 1844, the two have split. And so essentially it's an idea of the Community of Christ is essentially a Reform Mormon church. The people who stayed in the Midwest, who opposed polygamy, who opposed a lot of the late Nauvoo theology, and practices, so things that Mormons now consider to be considered temple practices. That's a Utah, those are all Utah things, and so anyway, those aren't part of it. But the Book of Mormon itself has continued to be a part of the canon, and so is part of the standard works of Scripture in Community of Christ, as is the the original Book of Doctrine and Covenants as it had existed up till 1844, and then with all of the additions that each prophet president of Community of Christ has brought ever since then. So we're now up to 165 sections, with a bunch of them not overlapping because of the sections of Joseph Smith material that the LDS Church added in the late 1870s. But in any event, we have lots and lots of additional sections from Joseph III, from Frederick Madison Smith, from Israel A. Smith, from W. Wallace Smith, from Wallace B. Smith, from Grant McMurray, and from Steve Veazey, who's the current prophet. And there may well be, I think we do have I think if we have inspired counsel that could, anyway, the World Conference is happening in just a few months, and it's the conference of the church that decides what to add to canon. So anyway, so the point of it is therefore that, yes, the first prophet of the church in which I serve as in the leadership, certainly as a pastor of the congregation here, was Joseph Smith Jr. And then thereafter, all the prophets that I've just mentioned, and the Book of Mormon is in our canon of Scripture.
And so your love for Mormonism is what?
I've devoted my entire life. I'm totally committed to service in my church, serving this movement, to reaching out and beyond the individual church, but to wherever we can do help beyond that. So I guess total.
All right. And are you trying to take people out of, are you trying to harm people's faith or get people to hate?
No, I mean, we've talked about this before in a previous podcast, which is Community of Christ doesn't consider itself to be the one and only true church on the earth, nor, in fact, do I consider Christianity to be the one and only true religion. Rather, we believe that we have a special calling that is informed by our heritage, that is informed by our special tradition that, frankly, to me, is vital enough that I want to stand on the rooftop and share it to all the world, to say that we have a wonderful way of finding meaning and of focusing on mission in this life, on doing things. Our mission here in Toronto congregation, as we say it at every one of our lecture groups on Tuesday, invite everybody into community to continually learn and grow, to abolish poverty and needless suffering, to pursue peace and justice on earth, and to live life meaningfully together. And so within our tradition, building that mission built upon the rich heritage that we have as a church, knowing that there's been all sorts of error, as all the prophets before, and all the members before are all human beings that are simply writing down their own human response to the divine. So our understanding of Scripture and Revelation is that text is all written by human beings, and it is within their own limitations. They're living at time and place when they may well be living in like the time of the Roman Empire, like Paul, who hasn't ever even imagined a world without slavery. And so therefore doesn't know any better than that. He's living at a time before they understand about the existence of sexual orientation. And so therefore he's just talking within the worldview, the limited worldview that is there. In other words, because they are limited by their time and place in history, they write their own human errors into everything, but everybody is trying to respond to the divine. So that's the understanding within the Community of Christ tradition.
I love it. And thanks to Scott and Dan and Leandro and others who have already shared this episode. We've got 13 shares so far, so another 17 will reach our goal of 30.
Very good.
We're getting there. All right, and welcome to, we've got about 60 people joining us right now on Facebook Live. We want to ask you to feel free to make comments and ask questions throughout this episode, because we love to make this as collaborative and as dynamic as possible. So we welcome your comments and questions as we go. All right. So John, without any further ado, should we dive into your presentation?
Sounds good.
All right. So I'm going to share the screen and I'll just advance it whenever you need me to advance it.
Okay. Well, just as one more introductory proviso here, although we talked about just now my own personal understanding and indeed the Community of Christ position on Scripture and the fact that this book is part of our canon. My presentation, however, is from an academic perspective. And so you do not have to have that view at all or share that view in order to, talk about this, because this is meant to be anyway, an academic perspective, as opposed to, it doesn't stop you from having a view, the other view, if you want to.
Yeah, so you're not trying to speak to any divine events that may have occurred. You're just basically saying, how do we understand the text?
Right.
Using
And
our
so,
best tools of science and scholarship.
And my views on the divine component of that are not incompatible with the academic stuff. So you could be academic, and you can come from an atheist perspective, and it would also be able to be understood exactly the same way. Whereas my view is not that precision, right? But anyway, academics is a place where you can talk about it more neutrally on a common ground of how we understand from, like I say, academic disciplines like literary criticism, like history, archaeology, and that sort of thing.
All right, let's dive in.
Okay, go ahead.
All right.
So, like I said, I want to talk a little bit about literary criticism just as a little bit of a precursor to this. And so this is an academic discipline. It emerges in Western civilization in the modern era. So my background in training in graduate schools is a medievalist. And so for me, modern times is more recent or longer ago than for most people. A lot of people use the word modern to mean, like the last 100 years or something like that, but I usually mean it to be since about 1492. So anything on, so modern times. And so it's something that we didn't have. People could judge texts a little bit before this, but all of the kind of the techniques and things like that are much more sophisticated. And primarily it develops in the West because of how important biblical study became because of the Protestant Reformation. So the Bible, which is now heart and center of especially, pretty much as we think of all Christianity, but it's especially central to Protestants because the Protestants decided that all of the other pillars of authority upon which Christianity had traditionally rested, so apostolic succession, tradition, the writings of the early Christians, that all of those were negligible, and in fact that sola scriptura, that the Bible itself is the sole source of authority, right? And so that's concomitant with this time period of the invention of the printing press, and so therefore people suddenly had Bibles, and they suddenly were translated into their own language where they could read it, so it wasn't just what the priests could read in a language that maybe you didn't understand. And so as a result, this relationship that Christianity has had with the Bible in modern times is absolutely different from what Christians had ever had prior to that. But part of that what became a real commitment to try to study that in all of the universities of Western Europe. And so the academic discipline of literary criticism emerged to just do that.
Yeah. And also, for those who are interested, my series with David Bokovoy goes into a really in-depth, experience with applying literary criticism, historical criticism, textual criticism to the Old and New Testament and the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants. And
oh, great, good.
It's definitely one of the best, top Mormon Stories interviews of all time. So don't miss the David Bokovoy interview if you really want to get into literary criticism.
Yeah, so this is going to be just a summary compared to anything like that.
Yeah, that's good. All right.
Okay, so I'll take a side trip here and talk about the story of King Arthur.
I love King Arthur.
A lot of people know a lot about King Arthur. There's present day, there's been TV series lately, there's lots of movies. Anyway, it's an enduring story that people know a lot about, right?
Yeah.
So let's go ahead.
So, tell us about King Arthur.
Okay, so the story of King Arthur, very well known today. However, in the earlier Middle Ages, so up until the early 12th century, he was totally unheard of. So nobody in Britain would have, England, and Norman England, let's say, would have ever heard of King Arthur or said anything about King Arthur. So all that changed in the year 1136, because in that year there was a British cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth who published a book called Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain. And he claimed that he had translated that into Latin, that Latin book, from an ancient book in the British language. So the history of the kings of Britain. Yep.
I hope you're not going to deconstruct my belief in King Arthur, but let's keep going.
No, you better watch out. So this became a medieval blockbuster. So Geoffrey's book gave a history, we'll say, of ancient Britain, including its greatest monarch, King Arthur. And Geoffrey, as an aside here, is also the author of a book of the prophecies of Merlin and a life of Merlin. And in all, actually, Geoffrey's work here is actually the first appearance of the character Merlin, too, as he's known today. So Geoffrey's history then of the kings of Britain is a medieval blockbuster, and the stories of Arthur and Merlin, as you know, and continue to be told and retold all the way up to the present.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out what the problem with all this is. So far,
Well,
so good.
Here's an example of how immediate this was a blockbuster. So they didn't have printing presses, and so when you're publishing things, you essentially, these are still manuscripts that have to be sent around. I think 200 some manuscripts of Geoffrey's books survive, which is crazily popular to have that many copied and that many already survive. And you can see here. It's not a very good mosaic, I don't think, but anyway, it's cool mosaic in the floor of the Cathedral of Otranto in the very south of Italy, so on the opposite side of Western Europe from England. Just 30 years after Geoffrey's book first appears, there's already, this is an important enough character, it says here, Rex Arturus, right, King Arthur. And so King Arthur is actually depicted in the cathedral, just within 30 years of the first time anybody had ever heard of Arthur. So he became immediately popular. And in part, this is because although Arthur was this ancient king, as the knights who initially monks because it's Latin, but then it becomes translated or written in French romances and things like that, medieval French. And so as the knights are hearing the deeds of Arthur and everything like that, even though he's this ancient character, all of the things that he does really coincides and really jived for them with the ideas of chivalry that were emerging in their class. So he was immediately popular because he spoke very well to the context of their present day. Next.
Okay, so far still loving it, loving everything you're saying.
So, here's anachronisms, John.
Wait a minute. Wait, there are anachronisms outside the Book of Mormon, and I'm joking. Actually, David Bockavoy showed us many anachronisms in the Old Testament and in the New Testament.
Yeah.
So for people that are just like, number one, think that it's just the Book of Mormon, or two, that for Christians that think that it's we all have anachronisms are everywhere. But keep going.
Yeah. No, so Christians generally, I would say, I talk to Christians all the time who try to make this kind of case about the Book of Mormon, and I can immediately, turn to different books in the Bible and everything like that, and have precisely the same complaints that they possibly have for the Book of Mormon. And so,
for listeners who don't know, tell us what an anachronism is.
So an anachronism, there's a bunch of different things it means specifically something that's out of time, out of place properly. And so I'll explain here, for example, in this particular text, the anachronisms that are in the Geoffrey of Monmouth's book about King Arthur, the history of the kings of Britain. So one of the things that happened is that so King Arthur, he portrays King Arthur as a British king who is, just to say, native Welsh, the first Celtic people that are there at the time of the Germanic invaders, the Saxon invaders. So he pushes them back on the one hand, and then while they eventually take over the island, right? Because obviously that's the way the history works, and it becomes the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and the Welsh are pushed into just Wales and Cornwall and places like that. But anyway, so immediately after he does that, he's such a great king that he then crosses the channel himself, and he conquers almost all of Northern Europe, all the way to Dacia, which is to say Romania. and even while he's there, then he fights against the Romans. The Romans bring out an army, and they're led by this completely otherwise unknown to history procurator named Lucius Tiberius, and King Arthur is really on the verge of conquering Rome when this whole thing with his what's his name, Morgan Le Fay, and everybody, call him back to England because of this rebellion that's happening back home. And so this is an anachronism in the sense that there's all kinds of anachronisms here, but in the idea that just anything, that this is a huge anachronism in the sense that there was never a British king at the time of the Saxon invasions that conquered all of Northern Europe. We would have that in all kinds of other different sources, from the time period. Essentially, I mean, this is a huge anachronism. Any other thing could be an anachronism, though. So, for example, if it's talking, I mean, an anachronism, for example, in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar is that when one of the different symbols that foreshadows the fact that Caesar is about to be assassinated is that the clock strikes. And of course, clocks are a medieval invention. As far as Shakespeare knows, they've been around forever, but of course they didn't exist. Mechanical clocks like that did not exist at the time of Julius Caesar. So that's an anachronism that Shakespeare has included in his play because he's not a historian, right?
Right. All right.
Okay, so this is how that works. And so in contrast, so when we're thinking about anachronism, the presence of the anachronism shows that the text isn't ancient, right? And so it shows that the text is 12th century and is not from the 5th century or whenever Arthur might have been meant to have lived as a if he were a historical figure. So the fact that Geoffrey's text maybe though occasionally gets something right about ancient history, that doesn't matter. So there's no such thing as a hit or a bullseye. Getting one or other things right doesn't wipe out the anachronisms. The anachronisms allow us to date it. Shakespeare might have said all kinds of correct things about Roman history. That doesn't make the play Julius Caesar any more likely to have been written in Roman times. It means that the anachronisms anyway and everything else help us, have us place it in the current time. So anyway, there's no such thing as hits or bullseyes that sometimes apologists for texts who want to maintain a view that they're ancient have. So the only thing that it can show is that if there is a whole bunch of material that is correct, so for example, it just means that Geoffrey of Monmouth in this case had access to earlier works of history, such as the Venerable Bede, such as Gildas. He may have had a king list. He may have had a list of historical figures, and Arthur of some kind of might have been on that list. But there's nothing. His stories about Arthur have nothing more to do with the character than that, right? So he's found a name, and then he's written largely a completely original story within. Anyway, and it doesn't mean that there is a true historical Arthur under that. So.
Got it. Yeah. So just because Nahum may be named coincidentally with some place in
That's right.
Saudi Arabia, that and the apologists may want to call that a hit, which many would disagree with anyway. That doesn't nullify or neutralize the problem of steel and horses in the Book of Mormon.
It's totally irrelevant.
Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. So how does this apply to the Bible?
Yeah. So like you said, you've already done a podcasts that are going to do this in a lot of detail, but this is really where literary criticism got started in the West, and so Christian scholars were very interested in the Bible and wanting to study it, and so the two different major branches of it, and you've already said and you already alluded to, are lower. It's actually more frequently now called textual criticism, and that's the idea of seeking to identify the transcription errors and reconstruct the original author's text. And so we know, for example, that there's this entire thousands-year-long manuscript tradition where the monks have to copy each copy of the Bible. And so when you're doing that, you can take a particular medieval manuscript, or let's say a manuscript of the Bible from the year 1300, and then you can say, well, this one is part of this family that was maybe coming through this particular earlier, let's say, Bible copy from manuscript from the year 1000, which maybe goes back to this particular one from the year 500 or something like that, because they all have the same sets of errors in them, right? And so because some point or other, if you in your copy, you inserted an extra line, or you accidentally copied twice a line, or you made any other number of errors, then those will often then be continued in all the ones that come after that. And so as a result of that, we can, on the one hand, try to reconstruct, when we go through all the thousands of manuscripts that we have, and especially using the best and earliest ones, we can identify, get as close as we can possibly can. We can never get to the original, but we can get as close as we can to what the original text would have been from the Bible. But then we can also kind of tell when a text is literarily dependent, you don't only, it's not just that it's literally dependent on the Bible. You can tell which particular Bible it's dependent on, and what particular and when that Bible first emerged. So that's one of the things you do with lower criticism. The higher criticism, or historical criticism, investigates the origin of the text and looks at its meaning in the historical context of the original author and who that author is writing to, so the original audience. And so whereas, for example, Christians, when they're doing exegesis and they're talking about the Gospels, and a lot of times they want to do historical background, and they'll try to say, well, in Jesus's time, this and that meant this and that. But actually the correct way of doing the context is not what's going on at Jesus's time, because the Gospels are not history books. They're rather, the context is the context of the author. So what were things like at the time that the author of Luke is writing in the 80s or something like that, and so that's the context.
Got it. Okay.
So we'll just look. You've already mentioned there's lots of anachronisms in the Old and New Testament, so it's not just the Book of Mormon in any way. And so we have learned so much more in 2 centuries or more of doing this about the Bible than anybody ever thought was possible. They didn't have this idea going in, but now just amazing amounts of study have yielded on lots and lots of results, including a bunch of scholarly consensuses. And so although for example, in the case of Isaiah, although there was a historical Isaiah probably who may have lived in the 8th century BC, before the Common Era, we still have within the book of Isaiah that we have today, so Isaiah 45:1, Isaiah is speaking to the Emperor Cyrus the Great of Persia, who lived 2 centuries after that guy, would have died, right? And so he's living in the 6th century BC. And so that's an anachronism, and so scholars agree then that the book of Isaiah in its present form results from later additions to the original ancient text. So,
and if I remember correctly, David Bokovoy said there's likely at least 3 different authors to the book of Isaiah. One being referred to as Deutero-Isaiah. Is that right?
Yep. So one's Deutero-Isaiah, and the other one, I think, is Tritio-Isaiah. So yeah, exactly.
And so that's the part of Isaiah that would have been written after Lehi left Jerusalem with the brass plates, which would mean that that part of Isaiah should not be appearing in the Book of Mormon, because they would not have been on the brass plates that Lehi would have brought over. But the Deutero-Isaiah is appearing in the Book of Mormon.
That's right.
And so that's a problem.
That's already a problem. It's going to turn out that the problem is so much bigger than that, that almost doesn't matter. But yes, because but that is certainly one of the problems in terms of the Book of Mormon and placing it. It's completely impossible for Nephi to be quoting, some of this Isaiah that he does, because, like you say, it's written after, not only after the destruction of Jerusalem, but after the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and when everybody's been back in Jerusalem.
Got it. Okay, so pseudepigrapha. We also talked about what that word means in the Bokovoy interview, but for those who didn't hear it or want a reminder, what does that word mean? So
pseudepigrapha means specifically authors who are writing under different names. And so you are, it's in a sense a pseudonym, but except for in this case, it's not a pseudonym. It's actually, you're trying to say that you are an authority from an earlier time period. And so in that sense, the continuers, who we are happily calling Deutero and Tritio Isaiah, are in fact, they're actually pretending to be Isaiah, right? And so in a sense, therefore, depending on how you want to look at it, and as a modern person, these are writers who are taking on for themselves the authority of the earlier author and continuing to write as if they were that person, right?
Yeah, and why would anyone do this? It's not necessarily with the intent to deceive. It can be with the intent to inspire and to get someone to be more religious and devoted to, for example, Jesus. So in other words, if you can write as if you're Paul or write as if you're Isaiah, then that word's going to have more authority. It's going to have more meaning. It's going to have more emotional impact for the reader. And so it's a way to to add credibility to what you're writing. It's not necessarily done with the intent to sort of forge and to deceive. It's often done with the intent to help.
Well, or maybe both.
Right.
So because I mean, the motivation is that they generally speaking are saying it may well be some of the cases someone has an anonymous text that they've written and that it has gotten attached. So then that one wouldn't technically be pseudepigraphic, so but in some cases, so for example, the epistle to Hebrews, people attributed that to Paul, but in fact it never says it's Paul anywhere. And so it's not actually pseudepigraphic, it's just some very early Christian writing, and somebody thought, well, that sounds like Paul. It's not Paul, but it got in the Bible because people thought it was. And so anyway, but it's not that person who was intending to deceive in that sense. But like you say, it may well be that for other people who actually are saying that, I, Peter, am writing this, like, for example, the author of 2 Peter, who clearly is not Peter, and I'll show that in a second. That person is, in a sense, there is still a sense of where they're deceiving, but then again, they're not necessarily doing that for filthy lucre or to get game or whatever it's going to be, but rather because they maybe thought that that there had been that counsel from Peter before and it's fallen away, that these important teachings aren't being heard, and so that these are being made. Who knows? We don't have to address their motivation, but we have to at least just explain in terms of the complexity of this.
That happens. Sometimes it could be a follower that heard the alleged author teach these things, and they're like, hey, wait a minute, my prophet's being misrepresented, so I'm going to write as if I'm them because I was there, and I'm going to correct the error that's out there, right?
Sure. So it could be any of those things.
Yeah. Okay.
So anyway, so an example of this, though, that's a little more stark is the Book of Daniel, which pretends to be the work of a 6th century BC prophet, but it's actually composed, at least in the form that we have it, in the between 167 and 163 BC. So we can know that pretty particularly, and I'll show you why in the next one.
Okay.
So because the Book of Daniel explicitly talks about the desecration of the Jerusalem temple at 167 BC by King Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and then accurately relates other minute details of the guy's reign. So it just goes on and on and on about, like, we might say, in Book of Mormon levels of predicting Columbus and the American Revolution style of literary prediction, Daniel just amazingly predicts everything about Antiochus IV, up until it predicts that the guy dies in a camp between Jerusalem and the sea, when in fact he dies completely elsewhere in a completely different area. And so because it isn't aware of the actual circumstances of Antiochus's actual death in 164 BC, scholars have all concluded that it's got to have been written after the events of 167 and yet before the events of 164. The Book of Daniel also, although it's very aware of this desecration of the Temple of Jerusalem, is not aware at all of the reconsecration that happens. And so in that sense, it's also definitely right from this time period.
So we can give a range.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty.
It was written after and before a certain set of dates.
Yeah, and that's one of the closest ones of any scripture we can actually date.
Right. Okay, well, that's valuable stuff.
Yeah. So then the other way, and besides anachronism, another huge tool in literary criticism that allows us to date texts, at least in a relative sense, is literary dependence. So when one text, if you've written a text and then someone has just copied word for word a quotation into their text, you know that the one with the quotation, the word for word quotation, is newer, than the one that was the original, right? And so that's a fairly obvious thing. And so but it has all kinds of consequences in understanding and dating texts. And so, for example, the 4 canonical Gospels of the New Testament, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they're all of those authors are writing in Greek. And whenever they have Jesus quote verses from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Bible, the text that these authors always use is the Septuagint. And so the Septuagint is an earlier translation. It's a translation made by diaspora Jews in Egypt between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. And so the point of that is that although Jesus and his disciples are very likely, the historical Jesus wouldn't have been walking around speaking Greek, they're most likely speaking the common tongue of the people in Galilee, which would be Aramaic. And if they're quoting scripture, Aramaic is fairly closely related to Hebrew, so there would either be just, maybe they might know the Hebrew and say it in Hebrew, or they might be doing their own personal translations of that into Aramaic. If that were the case, and you imagine the gospel writers, let's say, remembering what they said, although they're not eyewitnesses actually, or if there was some kind of a oral transmission of what they said in Aramaic coming down to them, then you would imagine that they would do their own Greek translation of that thing that Jesus was quoting, right? But what in fact happens is every single time, every time you get to a quotation that Jesus might be making from the Bible, from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, they in fact are getting the Septuagint. So what that's showing is that anyway, that the text isn't maintaining a direct quotation, at least in Aramaic, that then is retranslated into Greek, but rather as these Gospels are being literarily created by the individual evangelists, they are using the Septuagint as their source for the Hebrew Bible, for the Old Testament, and therefore, obviously, the Gospels are all dependent on the Septuagint, right?
And this also is going to be more familiar in the Book of Mormon, just this idea of using texts in a text, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there'll be all kinds of places in the Gospels where Jesus opens up the scroll of Isaiah and reads it, or something like that, and that you can see them quoting, right?
Yeah. Why? Yeah. Why not just?
You've heard it said that, an eye for an eye, but I say to you, that kind of thing. So they're quoting the Old Testament.
Right. And that's a commonly thing done, and it can be traced, and it can inform you about the sources of the text.
Yep.
All right.
Okay. So, in the same way, this shouldn't be too controversial that the canonical Gospels are all, uncontroversially, they're written after the Septuagint, since the Septuagint is from the 2nd and 3rd, the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, and the canonical Gospels obviously Jesus is in the 1st century AD, so the idea that the one is after the other is no particularly big deal, although there are a lot of implications from it that we won't have to go into. But anyway, that just is showing how literary dependence works.
And we can know, which texts were written before and after which other texts.
Yep.
All right. Okay.
So probably talked a little bit about then the issue, which is people call the synoptic issue between the first 3 of the Gospels. The idea is that they which give a different picture and largely very, very different text and content than John. John, for example, doesn't have any parables in it, which you're like, wait a second, Jesus teaches a lot in parables. There's all kinds of different things that are going on in John that aren't in the other 3. But the other 3 do are, they're called synoptic because they read together. They tell a very similar story, although differently. They overlap in material, but the material actually also, though, is a direct textual relationship. So between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there is a literary dependency relationship, and there's been a number of different theories that scholars have worked out. Logically, there's only a couple of different ways it can be. So either one of them is first, and the other ones are copying off of it, or they all have a common source that they're all copying from. In other words, there's a direct literary dependency among those 3. And that's just to illustrate this.
And we talk about that a little bit in our interview with Bart Ehrman. For those of you who want to get into historical criticism applied to the New Testament, Bart Ehrman's one of the world's top scholars in that subject. Yeah,
absolutely.
All right.
And so the one of those, just to explain that, the most accepted hypothesis with different variations is that the authors of Matthew and Luke independently made use of Mark. So Mark is the earlier gospel. Both Matthew and Luke the authors of those texts had access to that. And then there's another lost source, which scholars call Q, which is German for source, Quelle. And so anyway, that's a lost, unknown text. And so essentially this is how most scholars agree that the literary dependence works, which means then that Mark is the earlier gospel, right, than Matthew and Luke.
Yep. And of course, that's important because you can see how the story changes and grows over time once you know the chronology of which book is written when.
Yeah, so absolutely. Yeah, and if we go to the next one,
yep.
we can see exactly that, right? And so if we see that what happens is that both Matthew and Luke have these two books, which they find fault with in a bunch of different ways. What they both do is they chop up both of them, they intersperse them into writing their own text, but they also delete things, they also edit things, they change things, they add their own material. So it gives you, especially let's say when we have Mark, where we can see it directly and you can see how Matthew edits Mark, then you get a sense of the kind of things that are important to Matthew, right?
Yep. Yeah, super important stuff.
Yeah.
Because we just tend to think, oh, well, different people tell different parts of the story or they see it from different perspectives, but it all can be munged together as one big story. But that's
but it's not. So yeah, that's the way that it's often read, and that's even in the back of LDS Bibles. I think it's called the Harmony of the Gospels and things like that. It doesn't work that way where you push them all together. It's rather, you have the original source, and the next two are literarily dependent on it. And so it isn't possible. It's not like we're looking at, they're not eyewitness accounts, any one of them. But if they were, it's not like three different eyewitnesses could go into their own room and write this way, because they are using an overlapping of words that show that Luke is directly copying words out of Mark's book. So it isn't possible that they both go and they are writing these down individually or something like that. They're actually, when I'm saying literary dependence, it means you have the one book in front of you and you are using that text to make your text.
Right. Very good. Okay.
And so just to end on this point, I'm probably going to people want to talk about the Book of Mormon, and there's a lot on this, but I think that this little graph is interesting. And so one of the things that you can tell with this is if you take those two sources, if we look here at Mark, let's say, so 76% of Mark is used by both Matthew and Luke, but then a bunch of 18% there is used by Matthew, but not used by Luke. So Luke is much more likely to say, I'm not, I don't like Mark, I'm throwing that away. And then just a little bit was deleted by both of them, right? And so then we don't know, since Q is lost, we don't know about how much of that might have been lost based on that same thing. So they could have both deleted any number of parts, but you can kind of see then that essentially how these pieces work together. So 45% of Matthew's gospel is essentially derived from the contents of Mark, 25% from Q. There's 20% or so that's unique to Matthew, and 35% of Luke is unique to Matthew.
Right. Very good.
Okay, so I mentioned another one of these cases of literary dependence and also pseudepigraphical work in the New Testament is the epistle of 2 Peter. So there's a little tiny book called Jude, which doesn't get that read in the New Testament, but anyway, it claims to be written by Jude, who claims to be a brother of James, and James also is the brother of Jesus, although Jude doesn't make that case in this epistle, or the author of Jude doesn't, which shows actually probably that James, the brother of Jesus, was very important in at least one of the Christian communities that in a different way than later understood in Christianity. I got pseudonym in my mouth. I got that. There's too much. That's a typo there. But anyway, go back. So the relationship in this case again is that the person who's writing 2 Peter took the letter of Jude, cut it up. It's literally dependent, changes the context a little bit, writes more around it, and also claims that they are actively claims that it's the word, all of it is the words of the Apostle Peter. And so we can say very clearly then that, and everyone's agreed, that this is not Peter who's writing this, because in fact the text is literally dependent on Jude, and it's written, much later than Peter would have been around, and Peter probably isn't able to write good Greek anyway. So.
And for anybody who's like thinking, what does this have to do with the Book of Mormon? Why are we talking about all this? John is laying out all of these techniques and tools and ways of understanding relationships and validating and understanding the accuracy of documents, because all of this is going to apply to the Book of Mormon very directly, very soon.
Very soon. I think maybe next slide we'll see. Hopefully, yes.
Very soon.
So the same circumstance occurs in the Book of Mormon, right? So the Book of Mormon is literally dependent on the Bible, and that isn't a surprise to anybody. Although, though, as you already mentioned, John, that the Book of Mormon has an internal claim that it is using texts of the Hebrew Bible from prior to 586, so from prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, so the plates of brass, right, which is where presumably, some of these texts, anything that had been written up to that time. However, that's really been shown not to be the case. And so, for one thing, it's amazingly problematic. Almost even I don't think any scholars believe that for example, even the Torah, the Pentateuch, the 5 books that are attributed to Moses, nobody imagines that those were even compiled in their present form until after they returned to Jerusalem. So until the time of Ezra, and so as a result, those wouldn't even be possible to be the 5 books of Moses as we have them, wouldn't be available as of 586. Much less, as you mentioned already, Deutero, Isaiah, the other things like that.
Yeah, so a lot of the biblical text that the Book of Mormon claims to derive from would not have been accessible, to Jews, let alone to Native Americans.
Right, to anybody, yeah.
When they were accessing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even just the use of Jesus's name, right?
Well, that's even more, but I'm even talking about,
Right.
Yeah, we're going to get there, right? So yeah. So like you're saying, so actually what we can do in the exact same way that I mentioned about how the New Testament is, for all of its quotations of the Hebrew Bible is dependent on the Septuagint, we also can say that the Book of Mormon is in fact literally dependent on the King James Version of the Bible, not any other particular version. So study after study, of all the different components of it, everything like you were talking about from Isaiah, but more specifically then about, for example, the Sermon on the Mount, that as it's repurposed in 3rd Nephi, coming from Matthew, who obviously, anyway, is not written until decades after Christ would have supposedly appeared in the New World, much less Matthew, again, having combined, again, his text from Mark and Q, which also wouldn't have been written yet. And again, since you're quoting directly, not only from the Matthewan text, but specifically from, again, all of that entire text chain, all the way down until the manuscripts that you get to the King James scholars that they had, and the way that they put it into English, and then specifically the later version of that when it was printed with italics. And so one of the things that is very clear in the Book of Mormon is that when it diverges from the King James English, a lot of times what it likes to do especially is delete words that are in italics and stuff like that. So it's very aware of not only the King James Bible, but also which words in King James English are in italics. And so the dependence the Book of Mormon has on the King James Version of the Bible is really, really broad. So it is not just when Nephi is saying, "My heart delighteth in Isaiah," and just starts whamming in whole chapters from Isaiah, and you think, when is this going to end? Why do we have to listen to? We could read Isaiah in our own book, anyway. Why do we have to read this in Isaiah, or whatever? But it's all over the place. So I mentioned then all of the teachings that Jesus is having among the Nephites and Lamanites, anyway, the people of Zarahemla gathered there. Also, all the different sermons, all these sermons that are pulled out of the Pauline letters of King Benjamin's sermon, all the different writings that everybody has, all of these stories that of people, the jail falling down around them, of their bindings being loose, and these kind of things that are direct reworkings from Acts. All of these different ways, all the way through the book, is literarily dependent on the King James version of the Bible. So um, there's nothing that can be said about it other than that.
So the Book of Mormon, and we'll talk more about this, it's clear that whoever was writing the Book of Mormon, and apologists and even faithful Mormons are now going to agree with this, that it's pretty much obvious and irrefutable that somebody in the translation process or in the authorship process, whatever process you believe in, had a certain version of the New Testament or the Bible opened. And
That's
when
right.
they were writing down things from the Bible, they're literally copying text.
Right.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Okay.
So, like you were just saying, therefore, the only honest alternative option available. So if a person is trying to maintain some sort of historicity for the Book of Mormon, they're trying to maintain some ancient source other than the Bible, because we have the King James Bible as the direct literary antecedent. The only way you can assume that is that the Book of Mormon is a 19th century composition, a freeform original composition by Joseph Smith that is largely making use of massive amounts of biblical material that is being repurposed in different ways. It's being put into sermons. It's being repurposed as stories about as events in the Book of Mormon, and you have to then posit. As we did when this is almost the same exact tree as I was showing with Mark, and as Matthew and Luke are repurposing Mark, you have to posit that there's this missing ancient hypothetical source. But what you have to then do is identify which parts of the Book of Mormon clearly must be from that source. And so if there is anybody who's going to argue this, anybody who's arguing anything about antiquity, the Book of Mormon, they have to start by being honest and saying it's a 19th century book that Joseph Smith wrote that relies on the Bible, but I still believe there's an ancient hypothetical source. And then they have to go using literary criticism, go through and say, I think this is where the source is that is the actual ancient text. But I don't know that anybody's done this yet. But I mean, maybe somebody who's really forward-ranging on this issue, but it's certainly not mainstream anyway in the LDS understanding of this. So,
right. And what you're going to sometimes get, and you'll probably address this, is apologists who want to say, well, the Lord channeled Deutero-Isaiah to Joseph Smith, right? They'll want to find some way to make a tie, that doesn't require Joseph Smith to have, or God told Joseph to, translate or to put Deutero-Isaiah in there. And that just leads to a more liberal, flexible version of how the book got created. And that's why many apologists in 2019 are moving away from calling the Book of Mormon a translation and moving into calling it a revelation.
Well, even if you want to put it as God is the composer, then
right.
So then you have to again, it's still a 19th century text that God is composing in the 19th century that is based on this is your understanding. You're making a theological claim now. This is really not a historical claim anymore, because now you're asserting how God composes 19th century texts that are filled with anachronisms for God's particular theological purposes, whatever you're saying. But again, to be honest, you have to then say, this is a 19th century text that God is writing with these particular cases. And again, identify what's the ancient part that God is also drawing from here that you're trying to maintain. Parse both to get, that's not history anymore, it's theology. So all of the things that people want to do where they are doing that they have to, again, be honest at the front of it and saying, I'm making a theological claim based on my understanding, my belief in how God operates, and then specifically assert it to God, as opposed to, I don't know what they're, as opposed to pretending it's academic and saying, oh, this is still ancient in this way. It's
right. Makes sense. Yeah,
okay.
but then that begs the question, why would God create a 19th century book? Why wouldn't he create a timeless book that was accurate at all times and in all places?
Well, that's a theological idea.
Right.
So
right.
I'm perfectly open. People, what we're doing now, and I'm a theologian too, and I have my own theology. But what unfortunately happens here when we're doing this is people who have a very particular theological idea, or in some cases, anyway, however they want to call it, think of it, a supernatural worldview, which is a very particular, try to argue these points academically, but without being open about their particular, what their supernatural understanding of this. And I think they should just go ahead and bring that forefront and say exactly what they're saying the supernatural part of it is, and then then the whole rest of it's not in question. So, I mean, I'm going to be very open with my understanding of Scripture and how Scripture works, but this is the academic, what I'm talking about here is, like I say, the academic question, right?
Yep.
And so it's 19th century composition here is not in question academically. So, given the what am I trying to say there? Anyway, given that, it should be say that, not the given that its dating is not in question academically, then my goal in the rest of the presentation is to understand how we can best understand the text in its context, and then how we can understand how it was composed. And then the problem that we come to now is that a lot of times when now I'm trying to explain how we can understand the text, or how we can understand how it was composed, people assume that every one of those things is meant to be a proof. It's not a proof of how the text was made or how the text was composed. We have already proved that it's 19th century. It's over. Now we're trying to understand this 19th century text. And so every one of these these little things that I might say after this is not a proof. It's given that we've already understand it's 19th century, how do we understand it?
Right. Good. All right.
Okay. And so that's that little side component.
Yeah, no, that's important. Now we understand the tools that we can use to understand the Book of Mormon's creation.
Yeah.